Hey everyone, last time we looked at the start of Resonant Blade, a 2D action RPG, and some of the things that I started working on, like the player movement, combat mechanics, and some of the enemies. I'm looking forward to sharing some of my updates since then, so stay tuned. Alright, so just setting up the new workspace here. I'll actually be living in China for the next couple of months. I'll be working on Resonant Blade and trying to post a new episode every 1 to 2 weeks. So in this episode, we're taking a look at how the player can detect enemy weaknesses through sight and sound, how they can change the Resonant Blade's frequency, some more on the drone enemies, and getting a little bit into chord combos and this harmonic shield idea. So before, I talked about the idea of enemies having a certain weakness or resonant frequency, and the cool mechanic that I wanted to add was being able to detect that through both sight and sound. And the idea here is that the player comes across some advanced wearable tech that helps them detect the enemy's resonant frequency. This advanced technology is in the form of a headset visor that I'm loosely calling AV Augment for now, AV standing for audio visual. So when this is equipped on the player, they'll be able to see and hear the enemy's resonant frequency within a set radius around the player. Visually, I did have more of a gray particle field surrounding it, but decided to take that out because it was just too distracting while the player was in combat. This area around the player, this AV field, starts out very limited in size, but later in the game it can be upgraded. Anything that comes within the AV field will be displayed in color and emit a sound if it has one. And this includes things like the background, any interactable objects, and of course enemies. Why bother with the sound though if the player can see the enemy weakness as a color? The player might just turn off their sound and they can get by just fine. Well, that's not entirely true here. So besides the sound just being able to reinforce the visuals here, there are going to be times when the player's visor is damaged and not the headset part of the AV Augment. And in that case, they would, have to rely solely on their hearing and listening. The same could hold true for the headset part. It could be damaged and they would just have to use their sight, to match the color and find the enemy weakness that way. And I feel like this should make the interaction between the player and the game world more interesting and add more variety. I did add in some audio and visual cues to indicate to the player when their visor or their headset becomes damaged. So for the visor, the screen will get staticky with a bunch of colored noise for a few seconds. And for the audio part, the headset, all the sound effects will go quiet. Basically, they can't hear anything that emits a sound anymore in the game world, and they will only hear white noise for a few seconds. And I think those are going to be helpful for indicating to the player what part of the AV Augment is damaged. Later on, I might add in subtle UI indicators that also tell the player the status of the AV Augment. So once a player knows an enemy's resonant frequency, they can then tune or adjust the Resonant Blade to the same frequency by cycling through different frequencies with the Q and E buttons. I'm sticking with 6 pitches or frequencies that the player will be able to cycle through. If I added too many frequencies or pitches, then it would take a lot more time for them to cycle through, and I want them to be able to do this in the middle of combat. So basically, when a player hits the Q or E buttons, a little UI color wheel pops up below the player and shows them which frequency the blade is set to. Changing the resonant frequency of the blade will also change the color and sound of the blade to match it. And right now, some of the colors are too dark, like the blue and the purple, and those probably need to be changed to just brighter colors like a cyan and a pink. So here are some updates with the drone enemies that I've done. Instead of just having a red drone like I showed last time, I made a different color version drone for each of the 6 colors and frequencies that I'll be using. I made the code for the drone enemies more modular by creating an enemy class, so it's much easier to create a new enemy and set up its properties. I also made some smaller and faster versions of the drones that have way less hit points and do considerably less damage. And also, instead of just a simple little sprite that was shown for the projectile last time, I now have more of a laser pulse that matches the drone's resonant frequency and color. And it's pretty neat because whenever you have the AV field around the player, you only see the color of the laser pulse as it passes through the field, and you only hear it as it passes through the field as well. I also started building a defense mechanic for the player called the harmonic shield. So with this, the player will be able to select 1, 2, or 3 frequencies for the shield. The shield would protect the player from those types of frequencies depending on how many frequencies they select. So selecting 1 frequency would be 100% protection against that type, while selecting 3 would protect against all 3 of those types by reducing the damage by 1/3. The more I'm playing around with this idea and starting to implement it, it feels a little too complex, a little too clunky, and it requires, too much setup by the player that takes them away from the action. And the last thing that I've been working on was trying to figure out a way to implement this idea of the chord combos. Basically, I want the player to combine different frequencies into chords. Just like you can combine different notes on a keyboard, like C, E, G to make a C major chord, or C, E flat, G to make a C minor chord. I try to find a way to do this for the player to generate a ranged attack. The problem that I ran into here is that the controls that I tried for this ended up being very cumbersome and slow and really just take the player out of the action. The player can store 3 frequencies inside the Resonant Blade at one time. They would then have to select a frequency slot, set the correct frequency, and then repeat 2 more times for the other 2 slots. After that, they have to activate these notes. My thought here was that the notes could be set up before combat so that they know what type of chord combo they're using or which one they have equipped. Kind of borrowing from the character Marth from the Super Smash Bros. Series, the player would activate these 3 notes by combining the attack button, left click, with the direction, left, right, or down. In this case, I'm using the WSAD for movement, so they would click A and left click at the same time to activate the note that's equipped in the left slot. And then if they do these at the right time, then they would start charging up a special ranged attack. And this was way too complex and just not very fun. There's a lot of steps there just to, execute a ranged attack, and it wasn't really working. But I think I've come up with a much more intuitive and interactive solution that I'll share next time. And that's a wrap for today. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like, comment below, and I'll see you next time.